Welcome to episode 128 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent writing crime fiction inspired by true crime FBI cases. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Stephen Heaney, who served in the FBI for more than 25 years. His entire career was spent in the Philadelphia division, working primarily major thefts and violent crimes. In this episode, Steve Heaney reviews a tow truck ambush case where two tow truck operators hauling confiscated cars for the FBI as part of a drug investigation were ambushed at a busy Center City intersection by gunmen attempting to steal back the cars. During Steve's career, he served as a firearms instructor and was a SWAT team leader. For 10 years, he was the FBI's liaison with the Federal Detention Center in Philadelphia. He was later appointed as the Violent Crime Squad supervisor and then the healthcare fraud supervisor. He was also the crisis management and SWAT team coordinator. I think you're really going to enjoy this episode because Steve is able to take us through so many of the different techniques and tools used to investigate a crime. It is a thorough look at law enforcement investigative procedures. But before we get to that interview, I just have a few things, some real quick things here. First of all, I am looking for Firefighter Joan 77. Firefighter Joan 77, if you are listening to this episode, you are the winner of the It's a Boy, It's a Book giveaway. So that means that the FBI Silhouette Target Apron, the onesie for your future FBI agent, FBI Challenge Coin, lapel pins, an FBI Retired Case File Review, sticker, lapel pin, and podcast cards are all yours. You have until the end of the month to email me back so I can send you your prizes, or in September, I will select another winner. So I am looking for Firefighter Joan 77 to get in touch. And for those of you who missed my Facebook Live, where I selected that winner and also had a quiz and selected 5 other winners for FBI Retired Case File Review stickers and pins, I will put a link to the Facebook Live video. We had a great time, and I plan to do that again. I also want to remind everyone who has signed up for my reader team to check your spam filter. I hate to think that that's what's going on with Firefighter Joan. If you've signed up for my reader team and you haven't been receiving the monthly emails, check your spam filter. Who knows, my email might be there. And for those of you who haven't signed up yet, please do. Once a month, I send out a digest of the podcast episode show notes so you can take a look at the photos, the newspaper links, and any books or videos that relate to the case that we're reviewing. I also try to keep you up to date on what's happening with the FBI in entertainment news, any new TV shows or movies coming out, and I also give you my crime fiction recommendations. So if you want to join my reader team, just go to my website, jerrywilliams.com, Jerri, and sign up. I'll also put a link in the podcast app show notes so you can click on there too. And don't forget to subscribe to FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcast or your favorite podcast app. I do have a great crime fiction recommendation for you, a very popular book. So after the interview, please stick around and I'll tell you more about it. But for now, here's the show.
I am excited to introduce Steve Heaney. Hey, Steve.
Hi, Jerry. How are you?
I'm doing great. Now, I'm always looking for great cases, but of course, since I spent most of my career in Philadelphia, as you did, I love to highlight interesting cases out of Philadelphia. And the one that you're going to talk to us about today is definitely one of those interesting and unique cases.
Well, I'm looking forward to it.
So am I. This is a case that moved between two squads. It was a case that played out in the news because it involved a wild firefight in the street. But before we get to that, that's like a little tease. Could you set it up for us first and talk to us about the drug squad and how this whole thing started?
Sure. The case began with our Philadelphia Squad 3. They were one of the two drug squads in the office, and they had been actively working an investigation against a drug organization known as the Burgos gang. And the Burgos drug group was involved in dealing with a lot of money and secreting money in various places, to include possibly in vehicles. And that whole case was separate and apart from the squad I was on. I worked on our Squad 4, which was a major theft squad. We were completely unrelated to this investigation, and the only reason we became involved was because of the events that occurred between April 8th and April 9th that culminated in this shootout that you just described. So basically, what happened was, sometime on April 8th, late in the afternoon, early evening, some individuals tried to break into a storage facility in the Frankfurt section of Philadelphia, near Oakland and Folkrod Streets. And what they do is they try to break into these garages where they believe cars were parked or were being stored, and they believe there was money in these vehicles. The owner of the storage facility had been working with Squad 3, the drug squad, and responded either to this incident at his storage facility or there was an alarm, but he was able to disrupt the individuals who were trying to burglarize the facility. And then he subsequently reached out to individuals, agents on Squad 3, and said, hey, this is what happened. This is what's going on. Somebody's trying to break in here. I thought you guys should know about it. So the squad realized this is a problem, probably should try to get warrants and try to seize the vehicles if they're in these storage facilities. So that's what they did. They went ahead and got their warrants, and sometime during the day on the 9th, they went up there and, not wearing FBI insignia jackets like we wear on overt search warrants, they were being semi-covert. They were dressed down and nothing to identify them as law enforcement, and they brought in 2 contract tow trucks. So they were able to get into the storage facilities, able to breach the doors, open up the doors, and lo and behold, were 2 Mercedes-Benz vehicles parked in each of these garages. Just what they were looking for. But still, cursory look of the cars, there's no money in the vehicles.
Is that what the affidavit said? That the whole purpose of the search was because they had information that indicated the probability of there being money in these vehicles?
Yes, that's correct. That's correct. And they knew, the reason they got the search warrant, they knew they'd have to search the vehicles themselves. Nobody thought there would be money sitting right there in the back seat or the front seat, but somewhere secreted in the vehicle there would be money, possibly in the gas tanks or somewhere in the vehicle.
Do you remember how they knew that? And who gave them the information that these cars, and what were they again? Mercedes?
Yeah, both cars were Mercedes. And my recollection of that particular part of the investigation, I believe it was informant information that provided them the probable cause for the affidavits. So the 2 tow trucks, they backed them up. They loaded each of the vehicles onto the tow trucks. They were, I believe one of the tow trucks may have been the kind that hooks the front, and the other tow truck was a flatbed tow truck. And while this was going on, unbeknownst to the agents and the police officers that were involved in seizing the vehicles, they were being surveilled, and they didn't know it. And the vehicles are put onto the tow trucks, and off they go. And this was Frankfurt section, so it's further up 95, Interstate 95. The vehicles, the tow trucks, would follow the the agents in their vehicle and follow them south down 95 several miles before they came into the center city section of Philadelphia, the more business and highly populated area of the city, and then make their way to an off-site FBI garage, a garage where we service our vehicles, but we also use as an evidence response point and a place to store bureau vehicles. So they drove down 95. They're following the FBI vehicle. They make their way into Center City. They come off of 95 on Callahill Street. They turn right, so they're heading west. They get to 3rd Street, and at this point, they're only about, 6-7 blocks from the FBI office, actually. And probably maybe just a little bit further from the off-site. They turn right onto North 3rd Street, start driving down the street, and at some point, when they made that turn, because there's a light, the agents who were in the lead vehicle got further out ahead of the two tow trucks. And when they got to the end of, or the other end of North 3rd Street, where it intersects with Spring Garden, the agents made a right at the light. The light had turned red, and the tow trucks were coming up the street, started to slow down because they saw up ahead the light had turned red. It was at this point, unbeknownst to the agents and to the tow truck drivers, they were being followed by a green minivan with 3 individuals in the van. It sped up on the right side of both tow trucks, drove in front of the first tow truck, angled itself, stopped, and parked in the middle of the street. And this was in the middle of the afternoon, and people walking up and down the sidewalks. They stopped the van. Both tow trucks had to stop because of the way the van was positioned in the street. And the right front passenger got out of the vehicle, walked around the back of the van to the front of the first tow truck, walked up to the driver. He had a gun in his waistband, and he said to the driver, basically told him, "These are my cars. You need to drop these cars now." And he starts arguing with the first tow truck driver about these cars being his cars. The tow truck driver, Jimmy, explains to the gentleman, "These cars belong to the FBI. We're bringing them to the FBI garage, and that's who they belong to, and we're not dropping the cars." The guy on the street, he still thinks these 2 individuals are working for the Burgos drug gang and that they're moving the cars because Fernando, the gentleman who came out and confronted the tow truck driver, his group wanted these cars, and they tried to get them the night before. He figured Burgos was moving them. I got to get them now. Jimmy's explaining, "No, these are FBI cars. I'm not dropping them." He's saying, "Come on, man." And then he's getting upset, and he realizes at some point, this guy, whoever he works for, is not dropping the cars. So he walks around the front of the tow truck, goes to the passenger side, and as he does, Jimmy's sitting in the tow truck, and his passenger is his girlfriend. And his girlfriend is not saying a word. She's scared to death, and Jimmy says to her, "If he opens that door, I want you to lean back." And Fernando came around the front of the tow truck, came up to the passenger side, stepped up on the tow truck, and opened the door. And when he did that, Jimmy's girlfriend sat back, and Jimmy pulled out his gun and shot him in the shoulder. Fernando drops back after being shot. He pulls his gun out. He starts shooting at Jimmy as he circles to the rear of the tow truck.
Wow.
And starts firing at the back of the tow truck. He then turns, and one thing I might add, I neglected to say, while he was arguing with Jimmy, a second guy got out of the minivan. There were 3 guys in that minivan. The second guy got out of the minivan when Jimmy and Fernando were arguing and walked behind the first tow truck and got into the second tow truck with the second tow truck driver and demanded that he drop the car. While those 2 were talking, some point, the second guy that got into that second tow truck got out, and that's when Fernando had walked around, opened the door, got shot, and started shooting, because then witnesses said he took off running, the second guy. Fernando, who came around the first tow truck, started shooting at the back of the tow truck now. Then he aimed and started shooting at the second tow truck driver. That driver put his hands up in front of his face, and fortunately he did, because one of the rounds came through the windshield and hit him right in the hand, and then ricocheted off into the roof. Probably saved his life. Did a lot of damage to his hand, but probably saved his life. When Fernando came behind the first tow truck and was between the two of them, shooting at the rear of the first tow truck and shooting at the driver of the second tow truck, the third individual that was involved in this group, who was the driver of the minivan, stuck his gun out the window and started shooting at the front tow truck driver, Jimmy. Coincidentally, that individual who was shooting out of the minivan at Jimmy, his name was also Jimmy, but we didn't know it at the time. He's shooting at the tow truck driver, and then the tow truck driver is shooting out his windshield at the guy in the minivan who's shooting at him. So you have rounds going north on 3rd Street, south on 3rd Street, east on 3rd Street, and west on 3rd Street. You basically had rounds going in every direction. And my recollection is about 27 rounds were fired.
And people need to understand that this is in Center City, Philadelphia. This is 3rd and...
Between 3rd and Cal Hill and 3rd and Spring Garden. It's right next to the Philadelphia Police Department Fire Administration Building.
This particular area is where cars come off and on the highway. So it's not, there's some businesses there, but it is not a residential area. But people are still walking around, but it is not as concentrated as a block up or a block down. But
correct.
It's still a shootout in Center City, Philadelphia.
Yes, exactly. So what happens at this point is Fernando, the first individual who got out, who got shot and started shooting at both tow truck drivers, he eventually runs out of ammo and he runs, I believe, south on 3rd Street. That's the same direction that the second individual who got out of the minivan, he ran south as well. And then the third individual, who was the driver of the minivan, he then took off north on 3rd Street. And then the tow trucks drove off and headed towards the off-site FBI garage after this whole shooting had just taken place. And there was a woman who was on the sidewalk who had been shot in the foot. She was an innocent bystander who got shot in the foot during this gunfight. And it's amazing, fortunately, that she was the only one who got shot and only received minor injuries and recovered quickly from the shooting. But she was the only civilian that was hurt, thankfully. They drove off at some point. So now you have the bad guys have scattered. The trucks are heading towards the offsite to tell the agents what had just occurred. And when this was happening, I was in the office. I was on Squad 4. We actually worked between Squad 10, which is a violent crime squad. We were a major theft squad. And around the corner from us was Squad 3, the drug squad. The violent crime squad had police radios. They had detectives that worked with them on the squad. They often had the radios. If they were in the squad area, the radio would be on. And that's when we heard, coming out loud and clear from Philadelphia dispatcher, that there was a shooting in the 500 block of North 3rd Street near Spring Garden, involved FBI agents. It was an assist. We heard that. That's all we heard. We just heard the location, FBI, and assist, and we all took off out of the office and headed up to that location. A whole bunch of us got up there. The police had arrived just before we did because they were responding to shots fired in that location. We all get there. Nobody's there on the block. There's no tow trucks, no cars. There's police. The police blocked off both ends of 3rd Street at Spring Garden and Cal Hill, so no pedestrian or other civilian traffic had come through there. Agents had responded to that location, and then it was apparent something sure had happened. There had a woman who was injured on the sidewalk. She was taken to the hospital, and you had shell casings all over the place. And one of the tow truck drivers who had arrived at the offsite went on to explain what had occurred, what I just explained. And the second tow truck driver was taken to Hahnemann Hospital to the emergency center to get treatment for his injury to his hand. So we got there. It was a little chaotic, to say the least. And the Philadelphia police it was lieutenant or captain had shown up. A couple FBI supervisors were there. I was just an agent at the time. And there was a discussion about who was going to do what, who was going to take the case. And it was very apparent that the police didn't want anything to do with it. And Mike Thompson, who was the supervisor of our squad at the time, said, SWAT 4 is going to handle it. Carjacking, we got the case. The police were like, great, you got it. And they said, whatever help you need, we'll help you out. And they did. They kept control of the area as a crime scene for us, and also assisted in interviewing witnesses in the vicinity. And Mike Thompson came up to me. I'm on the street with a couple other agents, getting ready to do some interviews. Said, Steve, this is your case. You got it. Take it. So I said, okay.
And you said, thanks. Because it does sound like this is going to be a complicated and kind of tricky investigation because of those dreaded liability issues.
Yes.
So how it's handled definitely shouldn't, but of course will always play out in what is done, just because, you have to think about those issues. People are injured based on an FBI action, so the way that it's handled has got to be handled in a sensitive manner. Yeah, so good luck to you.
Exactly. And I was, I said, absolutely, I got it. My first thoughts were simply, we just had a shooting. We had a whodunit, who did it? We don't know who did this. It involved vehicles that we were towing. I knew in my head, this will probably be all over the news and the papers, but I didn't really care about that. We had to figure out who did this and who did this quickly. I knew that was going to be the issue. So one of the first things I did was just establish in my head that everything at the scene was being taken care of. And the police were there, cordoned off the area, so I knew the security of the crime scene was intact. There might have been a little bit of drizzle or rain, if I remember, but that was not a big deal. So we didn't have any crowds to deal with. Cell casings were where they were. Maybe there was going to be video. Who knows? This was back in 2002. Video wasn't as prevalent in all the public areas like they are today. So I went up to the evidence response team leader for Philly. It was Mike O'Brien at the time. And I said, Mike, this is your guys' scene. I know you guys are doing a great job. Do everything, take as much time as you can. And I'm going to go try interview some witnesses, and we'll go from there. So I grabbed one of my partners on the squad, Jay Heaney, and we found out that one of the victims, Jimmy, was at the off-site, but he wasn't injured. So I knew we could get to talk to him a little later. And I knew that one of the other tow truck driver had been wounded, and he was at the hospital, and he was at Hahnemann. So we went to Hahnemann Hospital, and we met up with him. He was in the ER. They had started treating him. His hand was really badly injured. I think he lost part of his finger. I think they found it in the tow truck when they did the search later. But he had a bad injury. He was quite upset, as could be expected, and pretty shaken up by the whole ordeal. But fortunately, he was able to compose himself, and we sat there for a while, and we took a long, extensive interview from him about what happened. And his viewpoint of the whole scene was, at that moment, the best viewpoint. He really laid out what happened, because he had a front row seat. It wasn't until after he was shot that things started to get a little crazy in his mind, but he had seen everything transpire up to that point. So we had a good idea about what we were looking at. We knew we had 3 unknown individuals. We knew they got away from the scene, but we also knew this was a drug squad investigation. There was probably information that they may have that can help us try to identify who they were. We got Jimmy, the other tow truck driver. He was interviewed, his girlfriend. We had the tow trucks. We held them down at the off-site because they were going to be, had to be photographed and evidence had to be retrieved from them. We had the 2 vehicles. We had them offloaded at the off-site too, and they sat in the garage locked up overnight. Nothing was done with them that day. And we had a bunch of interviews that were being conducted at the scene. The minivan got away. All we had was a green minivan. We didn't have a license plate or anything on the minivan. That fled the scene. He drove off north, and the other 2 individuals ran south in the opposite direction on 3rd Street. So all we knew at that point was they were in the wind. We don't know who they are. They're gone. They're no longer a threat to our drivers, anybody, and we'll figure it out. I had confidence we'll figure out who they were. But at that moment, once we got a picture of what had happened, knew everybody was safe, got all the evidence, got the scene under control, and we moved forward from there.
You haven't mentioned the two agents that were leading the tow truck. I mean, I would imagine that they are just absolutely flabbergasted and somewhat embarrassed.
Certainly, yes. There was somewhat embarrassment on their part, certainly. Maybe it wasn't the right tactical decisions were made in moving these vehicles from one location to the other, in light of the fact that some people were trying to get in there the night before. But, many of us have been through some of these situations before where we're moving evidence or moving witnesses and we make plans and, sometimes we overplan and we give the criminals more credit than they truly deserve. This was one of those instances where the criminals did need the credit they deserve because they were doing to the FBI what the FBI does to them. They were covertly conducting a surveillance of that garage area because they were going to break into it again when the opportunity arose. And then when they saw the vehicles being taken, they believed, Virgo's drug group, they're moving them, we're going to take them. We're not going to let them hide them again. We're going to get them. So there was a little embarrassment for everybody involved. You just don't want this to happen. A civilian got wounded, and there were no agents there to engage the bad guys, which would have ended that situation right before it started. So now we've left the hospital. All the evidence is secured down at the off-site, and so a large group of us go back to the office later in the afternoon, and we meet in the conference room with our squad, people from my squad, the drug squad that was involved in the search warrants, and some of the police detectives and some of the narcotics guys came to the meeting as well. And we all sat down and collectively, hey, let's put our heads together. Yes, the FBI we're working the case, but, we're all one big happy family in Philly with the Philly PD. Let's sit down, put our heads together. Let's try to figure out who this could possibly be. No names came up. Nobody really had any individuals that they believed could have been involved in this. But there was sort of a rush to, hey, let's get photographs together and let's put some usual suspects in photo spreads and let's show them to the victims and see if somebody picks somebody out. And it was at that point that I said, okay, let's take a time out. We don't know who's involved yet. Let's not taint any photo spreads down the road or any other information we might get by putting out some photo spreads of people, and we don't know even if they're involved, and some people may get picked or the wrong people may get picked. We don't want to do that. Let's at least know we got one of the shooters has been shot. Jimmy said, I shot him. He goes, I know I hit him. I hit him right in the shoulder. He fell backwards. I know I got him. So with that, we put out a notice on NCIC in the Northeast to law enforcement. If anybody should show up to a hospital with a gunshot wound, particularly a gunshot wound to the shoulder, please notify Philadelphia FBI. We sent that out. It was sent out, and we let it go. During that process and when that happened, sometime early in the evening, a caller called into the FBI office. I got a page come to the switchboard. Hey, an individual just called in. He heard about the shootout, and he knows where the van is that was used in the shootout. So we talked to him on the phone. He started providing a few details that weren't released. Nobody would know unless they actually knew or believed they knew where the minivan was. So a group of us got together. Nighttime had come. We met up in North Philly, and we had the phone number of the individual who called in. He said he wanted to meet us. So there was 4 or 5 of us. So that's where I decided, hey, this thing's starting to get a little bigger, spread out a little bit. Let's take let's designate some roles. And Ed Gallant, awesome agent, he goes, I'll go debrief the source. I said, Ed, perfect. You got it. You go debrief the source and call us back and let us know what the deal is. He goes, meets with the source, starts debriefing, lets us know, hey, this is the location. This is where the car is. He said that minivan is parked up in a garage in North Philly. He goes, I believe the source. He's spot on with his information. I believe him. And if Ed said he believes him, then I believe him. And so now we had an address for a garage in North Philly off Germantown Avenue, where that green minivan that we believe was involved in the shooting earlier that day with the tow trucks was parked in this garage. So we then reached out back to the office. We're going to need some more people. We reached out to the Philly PD, and we drove up to the garage, and we met with the owner up there, told him that this is what happened today, this is what we believe, and we secured his garage. He had an office area, he had an empty garage where he detailed vehicles, and then he had another garage. There was an adjacent garage that was locked, and he said he didn't have access to it. It was part of the same building of this business. So we decided, well, we're not even going to attempt to ask for consent. We will just get a warrant for this location based on the source's information. So we reached back out to Ed, who was with the source. We said, Ed, listen, we got the garage secure where new source says the minivan is parked. I'll reach out to the U.S. Attorney's office. I'll find out who's got the duty. And once I get the information, I'll give it to you. And then I'm going to marry you two up so you guys can start working on paperwork, working on affidavit and a search warrant. And we'll keep the scene secure, and we'll do interviews up here and see if we can find out some more information. So that's what I did. I reached out to the attorney's office, found out who the ASA on duty was. It was Anita Eve. She was working. I had Ed reach out to Anita. They got together that evening. Ed met with her at the office, knocked out an affidavit for a search warrant. The judge, the magistrate at the time, was Stacey Angel, and she was the duty judge. And we were out at that scene for several hours into the evening, because as you know, it's off hours. By the time they get a hold of the judge decides when he or she's going to see them. That took some time. So during that time, we got plenty of time to interview several of the people in and around the garage and interview the owners. And it was apparent the people that operated the garage were lying. However, they stuck to their lie. We knew, or we believed, based on the information from the source and based on our interviews with them, that the individuals involved in that shooting brought that minivan there, locked it in the garage, and were at that scene for a short period of time before they left. And that was the information we had. So we waited, we got pizza. It was a long night. Knew it was going to be a long night. And it was about 12:30 a.m., I believe, somewhere around that time. Ed showed up on the scene, search warrant in hand. Evidence response team was there. And the orders were simple. Open that garage door. If that minivan is in there, nobody touched the minivan. We're going to take the minivan out. We're going to throw it up on a flatbed, and we're going to take it to our off-site, and we'll search the garage, and there was an apartment upstairs, which was also part of the search warrant, and we'll search that as well. So, sort of like the Geraldo Rivera, Al Capone time, where what was in the safe, and he opens the safe, there was nothing in there. That was my thought. I'm hoping that garage opens. There's a minivan there. And we popped the garage door, and there it was. Green minivan was there, bullet holes and all in it. And we knew we hit pay dirt. I knew that minivan was going to be the link. That was going to be our way of finding out who these individuals were, at least who everybody was that was involved, and find out the true story.
So your source knew about the location of the minivan, but he did not know the identities of the people who put that minivan in there?
Correct.
And you believe that?
At the time we did, yes. Yes, and based on how he knew about the van, my recollection, it didn't surprise me he didn't know who these guys were, because a couple of them weren't even from that area. So, yeah, that part we didn't have a problem with. It was the problem we had with the people that worked there about knowing who came and who went from that location. The driver knew right where to go and where to hide that van. It hadn't been much longer, that long a time from when the incident occurred to when that van showed up at that garage and was stored there. So we took the van, we brought it back to the off-site, and finished up our interviews, did a search of the apartment above. It was sort of like a flop apartment. There wasn't much in there. We did recover a loaded Tech 9 in the apartment, seized that. Wasn't associated with the events of the day. but we took it anyway. Didn't want to leave that laying around for somebody to get hurt. And then we vacated the area and went back to the office. And it was probably sometime around 3, right before I left the office to go maybe get a couple hours of sleep and come back and start over again. A phone call came in from NYPD, and they were responding to the message, the NCIC message about a gunshot victim responding to a hospital. And basically we reached out to NYPD and they told me that they had an individual at Columbia Hospital, I think it's Columbia Hospital, who came into the emergency room and was complaining of a gunshot wound in his shoulder and said he got robbed at a bodega in Philadelphia. And I knew when he told me that we had at least one of our guys, because there's no way somebody is, even if that even happened, was going to go all the way up to New York and do that. It just didn't seem logical. And subsequent to that, because he was from New York, that's why he went to New York. But we had that information. So I reached out to New York Division, reached out to the substance squad that handled the same violations we did, said, hey, look, there's a guy, this is the name he's given, forget the alias he gave at the hospital. He's there being treated for a gunshot wound to his shoulder. He's claiming he was robbed at a bodega in Philadelphia. We believe he's involved in a shooting to try to carjack some seized vehicles that the FBI had seized pursuant to warrants. Can you guys go as soon as you can that morning and go interview him? And absolutely, they said, yeah, that morning, sometime that morning they'll go to the hospital and they'll go talk to him. So that was it. I left it at that. I went home, got a few hours of sleep, got up, reached out to New York again. They said they were sending agents were on their way up there to go interview the subject that was in the hospital room there. I said, great. And then we continued with our investigation that morning and afternoon with the 2 vehicles that were sitting in the off-site. They needed to be searched. And both gas tanks had to be removed from the Mercedes-Benz because they searched the vehicle and they found no money. So they removed the gas tanks because I believe there was some information from the source they would be secreted. Money might be secreted in the tanks. So our illustrious mechanic down there, he cut open both gas tanks, and in both tanks was a total of about $852,000 in cash.
Wow, $852,000 in cash in both of those gas tanks. Now you have to explain that to me. I do not claim to be a car person. If you put money in a gas tank, aren't you going to get gas all over your money?
Absolutely. They had previously removed the tanks, cut the tanks, built a wall down the middle of the tank where I don't know how many gallons a Mercedes-Benz gas tank is, but let's just say for argument's sake it was a 20-gallon tank. They walled off half of it, so you could put 10 gallons of gas in the car and drive it, and the other area where there would be gas, which is walled off and sealed, that's where they had the money. So they could put the money in there. They had a way to secrete the money in there, and then they had it walled off so they could still use the gas tank and drive the car. And they did that to both gas tanks.
Wow. Not very good gas mileage, I take it, those 2 vehicles.
No, probably not. That's why they sat in those storage facilities for quite some time.
Does this happen other places, or is this unique, hiding money in a gas tank? Because I've never heard of that before.
I don't know that I had heard about it at the time, but I was told that wasn't necessarily a unique thing to do. It was certainly a thing that this particular drug group did, but I don't think it was the first time it had been done. But those weren't the type of cases I worked, so I was amazed at the ingenuity and the forethought they put into hiding that money. I think one tank had close to 500,000, and the other one had a little over 350,000 in there for a total of 852,000.
But now we get a really good understanding about why those 3 guys tried to stop the tow trucks and take possession of the Mercedes.
And they certainly thought, as we found out subsequent, but they certainly thought once they just stopped the cars, that these two guys, whoever they were towing them, certainly wouldn't want to do anything to jeopardize their safety. Would just drop the cars, and these guys would just take the cars. I don't know what they plan to do if they had dropped the cars there, but because I don't think that there was any gas in those cars, but they didn't think about that part. But they wanted to drop the cars. But yes, certainly for an easy.
They didn't even know if there were any keys.
Right, but it was an easy payday. It was an easy payday. They knew there was going to be a lot of money in those cars.
So you have this guy with the shoulder wound in New York. You have agents trying to interview him and identify him. Are you getting any identifying information out of the van?
Out of the van? So yes. So he's being interviewed up in New York, and of course, he's initially lying to the agents up there about who he is and what happened to him. But
of course.
But two smart and wise New York agents, they plugged away and hammered away at him for a period of time, and they eventually broke him. And he gave up enough information that we at least had some idea about what was going on. He didn't fully cooperate, but he gave him enough information for us to work on. But at the same time, we had the minivan at the off-site garage, and that was processed. And our evidence response team did a fantastic job out at the scene and did a fantastic job with the minivan. They were able to lift some prints off the van, and they were eventually sent down. They were given to me, and then I sent them down with a lot of other evidence we seized down to our lab to have those prints looked at. But that took, like everything else, that took some time. In the interim, after we had gotten some information from the individual up in New York who had been shot, we finally got his real name, and his real name is Fernando Sanchez. And I think he's about 27 years old, and I think he, at the time, had a parole violation warrant on him, possibly from New York. So he wasn't going to go anywhere. So he wasn't going to be going anywhere. So we knew we had him in pocket. And now we had two other individuals. We didn't have any idea who they were. Through the minivan, we found out who owned it. We reached out to the owners, had them come down to the office. It was a young woman who owned it, Hispanic woman, and she came down with her boyfriend. They were kind of an odd couple, as I remember. She was short and very heavy set, and he was a real diminutive type of guy. And she came in and laid out the whole scene, how she got carjacked. And after we were done with her, we realized she was lying through her teeth as well. But I let her tell her lies. She stuck to it for a while. I said, okay, to myself, we'll come back to you. I know this story is going to change because I know this isn't what happened. But we at least knew who owned the van. We had her information. And I struck up a rapport with her boyfriend. Subsequent to those interviews, he would periodically call me up with tidbits of information about things he heard on the street about the case. And so we have Fernando identified. We have the owners interviewed. We've got evidence from the minivan, and we have then a couple of nicknames for the other individuals involved, the other two individuals. And those nicknames came from Ferdinand, who was in custody up in New York at the interviews from the agents. We had a nickname of Yusef, and we had a nickname of Tech, T-E-K or something like that, Raw Tech or Tech. Those are the two nicknames we had. We had anything beyond that. With that information, you do what you do. You reach out to all the squads, you reach out to the drug squads, here's some nicknames. Can you query your informants, see what you have, see if anybody's ever heard of these individuals, does anybody know anything? And so some time went by and weren't getting much information back. And then the boyfriend calls me up and says, hey, I might have a name for that tech guy. He gives me a name. I'm like, okay, kind of a nondescript name. And it was literally within an hour of Kevin Lewis coming up to me and saying, hey, I've got a very reliable source. He says, this guy Tech, his name is Chad Johnson. Well, it was similar to the name that the boyfriend of the woman who claimed her car was carjacked. I said, all right, I think we might have, we probably have our guy. We had at least a second guy identified. So with that information, went to the police computer, pulled up photographs, get Chad Johnson, give it to Kevin. Hey, go show your source. He goes and shows the source, says, yep, that's the guy. That's Tech. That's the guy, that goes by the nickname Tech. So with that information, we thought, okay, we may have the second guy identified. So I took Chad Johnson's, information because he'd been arrested. He had several arrests. I went through his police record, pulled all his arrests, went through reports, found one report where he was recently arrested, and there was, I think, a conspiracy charge or something that led me to believe he wasn't the only one arrested when I read his criminal history. So I went up to East Detectives, and I don't know if you remember all East Detectives, but that was as bad a building or setup that the Philly police had that I could remember. Fortunately, they're in a new facility now, but that place was really run down. It was in a very rough neighborhood, and I went into the East Detective Division, and it was just a big room with a table that went from one end to the other with a divider in the middle, and you had all these detectives crammed on top of each other, banging away at the reports, doing unbelievable work despite the conditions they work in. I found the detective that made that arrest. He says, yeah, I've got the reports here. He made the copies, took the reports, went back to the office, scoured over the reports, and saw that he got arrested with 3 other people, and one of the people he was arrested with was a guy named Jimmy Brown. I honed in on that particular individual because he had a parole violation, and he was immediately taken by state parole when he was arrested by the Philadelphia police during that traffic stop that also picked up this guy, Chad Johnson. Chad Johnson was in custody as well because I think he had either an attempted murder or a murder warrant outstanding on him as well.
How much time has gone by since the shootout in the street and now when you are starting to identify the other 2 people involved?
You know, it's hard to recall, but I want to say it was at least a couple of weeks had gone by before all this information came about. Because
and during that time period, they had gotten arrested?
No, they had. Oh, I'm sorry. No, let me take that back. It had to be a little longer than that. It had to be longer than that because yes, they get arrested subsequent to this, but I think it was sometime in May. This occurred it was either late April or early May. They get picked up, these 2. And this happened on April 9th of 2002. So I think it was sometime in either late April or early May they get arrested. So it might have been a month afterwards, or so when I pulled that paperwork after they had been picked up. And so we had these 2 names, and I got the criminal histories of Jimmy Brown. I had his information, got his photograph. I had Chad Johnson's photograph. I had Fernando's photograph because he was identified early on. And so I went out to go see Jimmy Butler and the other tow truck driver to go show photographs to say, hey, were these individuals involved in the robbery? Neither of them could identify Jimmy Brown, who was the driver. He was the driver of the minivan who was shooting at the tow trucks from the minivan. They never got a look at him, and it was apparent that they couldn't identify him. So that wasn't a problem. Then we had the photograph of Chad Johnson. Well, the first tow truck driver couldn't identify him because he never really saw him. His only interaction was with Fernando. However, the second tow truck driver did identify him because Chad had actually got into the truck with that tow truck driver and then got out. So he had some time, rather than just a flash, he actually spent a little bit of time interacting with him and looking at him. So he was able to identify him.
Let me ask you this question because I know there are a lot of law enforcement people that listen to this show, and they're going to want to know, is this single photos or are you showing them a photo spread? And either way, what was your decision on what to use?
Okay, so at the time, so this is in 2002, I was simply utilizing basically what the Bureau handbook said on photo spreads. 6 photos, 3 photos across on the top, 3 photos across on the bottom. It could have been 8 because I know Philly PD used 8 photographs when they did their photo spreads, and often you could go on the Philly PD computer to pull pictures off, and it would help you create a photo spread, and it would do it with 8 photos. So I can't remember. It would have been at least 6 because that was the policy at the time for the FBI, and it could have been as many as 8 because often these photo spreads were created off the Philly computer. So it was either one or the other, but it was it would be all 6 or 8 photos shown at one time to the witnesses. But my caveat before I showed any photo spreads, because I knew that at times people feel obligated to pick somebody. You don't want to be any bias or prejudice towards somebody or anybody to think that law enforcement gave any indicators to the witnesses to identify anybody. So there was always a spiel I gave prior to showing these photo spreads about there's no obligation to pick anybody out. We don't even know if the perpetrator involved is in these pictures or the subject is involved. You don't have to pick anybody. So by the time they see the photo spread, I try to make sure that they are not feeling anxious, they're not stressed out about seeing the photo spread, and that there's no pressure. And I would spend time with people before I show them to make sure I believe and I could articulate from the witness stand that this witness was not cajoled or coerced or intimidated or obligated or felt any stress or pressure into identifying anybody. Certainly there was no identification of Jimmy Brown from anybody. Only one of the 2 drivers could identify Chad Johnson, but certainly it was an individual who spent more than just 10 seconds or 15 seconds with him, probably spent a minute or 2 interacting with him. And then I had Fernando Sanchez photo, who I showed to Jimmy Butler, the first tow truck driver, who had quite a long interaction with Fernando. And when I showed him, I've shown many, many photo arrays and photo spreads in different configurations over the years. And I showed this one to Jimmy Butler, and he almost passed out. He was very tense and anxious prior to us showing him the photo spread. And once I finally relaxed him and calmed him down and got him to a point where I knew we could show it to him, when I showed it to him, I just laid it on the desk, he stood up, he actually started hyperventilating, and he almost passed out. We had to grab him, sit him down, relax him. We didn't say one word to him. We didn't say anything. Finally calmed him down, and we asked him, Jimmy, are you okay? And he said he was okay, and then he points to Fernando Sanchez and said, that's him. That's the one who pulled the gun on him. He had to shoot to save his girlfriend, and that's how that incident affected him.
Wow.
This was clearly sometime later.
I have heard, I guess there was even a TV show about tow truck drivers and repo people and how that's a very dangerous job. Nobody wants to see their vehicles being driven away down the street. And I take it that's why he had the weapon with him.
That's correct. Yes, he legally possessed that handgun, that pistol, and he used it justifiably. There was no the Philadelphia Police Department quickly adjudicated him of any criminal culpability for using that firearm. He used it in self-defense.
Absolutely. You know, when you have a weapon and you're ready to protect yourself, that doesn't mean when that opportunity comes up and you have to do it that you're not disturbed or traumatized by the fact that you had to, use that type of force.
Yes, exactly. And that's how he felt, and certainly it continued to affect him that way, because I think sometime down the road, I remember I talked to him. I think it might have been a few years later. He had completely got out of that business. He couldn't do it anymore. That day changed him. He didn't want to put himself in a position where he would be in fear of his life or in fear of his girlfriend's life.
That's understandable.
Absolutely. So we had our 3 guys identified. So now we have them identified. And as things would happen, we get Fernando Sanchez brought down from New York. We get him arrested. I think by complaint. Brought him in, and immediately got with his attorney and wanted to talk, and he cooperated, and he laid out the whole scheme about how he knew about these cars when he was in prison up in New York, and he knew this Burgos fella and his group used to secrete money in vehicles and where they used to store them. So when he got out, he was going to make it a point to go steal them and go to Florida and make it big with his newfound wealth. And he recruited these other two individuals. Jimmy Yusef Brown was his nickname, and Chad Tech Johnson, who was part of a Ram squad, some sort of group and drug squad that Squad 2, our other drug squad, had an active case on at the time. As it turned out, a fingerprint that was lifted from the minivan was matched and identified to Chad Johnson. So we were able to put him not only with the van, but we were also able to put him at the scene because he was identified by the second tow truck driver. And we had Fernando, who was cooperating. He identifies the other two individuals as well and puts Chad Johnson at the scene. Probably the most difficult part of the case was putting Jimmy Brown at the scene, because Jimmy Brown, we don't get any fingerprints off the vehicle. Surprisingly enough, he was the driver. We don't get any fingerprints off the vehicle from Jimmy Brown. We have nobody identifying him. And we were actually able to pull some surveillance video from a parking garage on the block. I found out there was a garage there that was an entrance that was adjacent to where this whole scene took place. And there's a camera that shoots out actually onto the street, but it's really capturing people as they come and go from the garage. But if there's no cars coming in or out, you see video of the street. It wasn't the best video. It was grainy, but it corroborated the movements of Fernando and the other individual, Chad. You could see them, where they were moving to, when the shooting started, how he moved around the truck, and corroborated not only the victim's testimony, but also the testimony of Fernando, who certainly comes with tons of baggage and when he's cooperating with us. But the video then also corroborates their information. And also, our evidence response team did a phenomenal job at the scene. They located every shell casing, did a great job sketching that scene, photographing the scene, where every marking and photographing and plotting where every shell casing was found. Shell casing was found inside the door of the minivan, and that was important because not only can't put Jimmy Brown at the scene other than with Fernando. We have the claim from the witness, the tow truck driver, that Jimmy Brown's shooting at him, but we also have to show that he was shooting. We don't have another gun. We don't find that gun. And those shell casings, I had them sent off to the lab, our lab, and they identified that 3 separate firearms were used. And based on where these shell casings were found and expert testimony, we could show that somebody was shooting from the driver's side door or driver's side area of that minivan. We could show somebody was shooting from inside the tow truck, out the right passenger door and out the front, and we could show somebody was shooting as they ran around the side and back of the tow truck as they were making their escape, based on where all the shell casings had landed in the street. And it was a great job by them. And so now we have Jimmy Brown and Chad Johnson, who were arrested together, so at least we know they're associates. And we had Jimmy Brown also identified by going back to the woman whose car was carjacked, who initially lied to us. Well, eventually she came around and told us the truth, and she was able to put Jimmy Brown in the minivan prior to the incident.
Did she loan her car?
Yes, she loaned her car. She loaned it because she was afraid of them, but I also think Fernando was batting his eyes at her, and she was a little bit smitten with him, and I think she didn't think anything of it by giving him the minivan. She knew they were going to be up to no good. She had no idea, and I believed her, and there was no way for her to know, that they were going to do what they did. Because they didn't even know they were going to do what they did. They thought they were just going to take the cars and it was going to be a big deal. But she didn't know that. But she was able to put Jimmy Brown in that van as well. So that was that testimony by her. Fernando cooperated. Jimmy Yusef Brown and Chad Johnson both went to trial. Trial was about a couple weeks.
All the stuff that you have on them, they still went to trial?
Yeah, they both went to trial. And the argument for Chad Johnson was he had no idea that they were going to carjack. He just simply was going along to steal a car. He had no idea that any of this was going to happen, so he shouldn't be culpable for any of this, was basically the defense. And Jimmy Brown, the argument was that wasn't him, he wasn't there. But a good case was put on by Anita Eve. We had great testimony by our witnesses, by expert testimony from the lab regarding the shell casings, regarding the fingerprint, and all that. Put all that together, we had a guilty verdict brought down by the jury on both those individuals. And interesting enough, during the trial, like I'm sure if some are listening to the podcast, they've had trials before, and they always have a witness or two who you have some problems with. One thing I'll never forget was, as I was at the table with Anita, and we were going to bring our next witness in, we were bringing in the owner of the garage, the one who reported to the agent, said, hey, these guys were trying to break in the night before. He originally was cooperative. He shows up at the courthouse. He's in the witness waiting room. He's in there by himself. I go in to get him. I said, can't remember his name. I said, hey, how are you doing today? You're going to be going on in a couple of minutes. How are you feeling? And he goes off. And he starts yelling and screaming at me in the witness room, and he's not going to testify. So I let him vent for about 5 or 6 minutes. He was as upset as anybody I could see, and finally he just stopped because he was so exhausted from his venting. And I just simply said, are we going to be a man now and go in there and do what we're supposed to do and do the right thing and testify? And he goes, I'm sorry, yes. And then he walked in there and he testified and did a good job. And that's what set up the whole story for the case.
But what was his problem? Because he had been cooperating from the very beginning.
I think it's just scared. Now they're at the point where they have to come in and testify. Don't think he'd ever done it before. He's going to be sitting in there testifying to the two of the individuals who allegedly were involved, because as far as he knows, it's alleged. They're still in trial. They're innocent until proven guilty. But as explained to him often and to many of the witnesses, you're just providing just a small piece of a big puzzle. You're not the person who's putting them in jail. You're not the one. Your testimony isn't going to bring that guilty verdict or not guilty verdict. You're just a small piece of the puzzle. His was just a piece of the puzzle, and if I recall, I don't even think he could identify them from the night before. So he wasn't an eyewitness testimony. It was simply just that he had responded to the break-in and stopped the break-in and then let the agents know what had happened.
Interesting.
So,
what was the final outcome?
So Fernando, I think Fernando, with his cooperation, believe it or not, got a lot less time than I thought he would. I think he ended up getting 15 years. And Chad Johnson and Jimmy Brown, who had been convicted of trial, both got 20 years. I think it was about 4 years after. Mind you, Fernando was 27, Jimmy Brown was 26, and Chad was 26 at the time of this incident. Chad Johnson, about 4 years after he was incarcerated, died in prison, natural causes. Jimmy Brown is still in federal custody, and Fernando, I think, was released last year. However, I don't think he was released to the public. I think subsequent during that time, he was being investigated for some other either attempted or a homicide up in New York by NYPD. So I think there was another case coming his way once he was released from federal custody.
Poor Fernando. So I guess one of the best things about this case is the cooperation that you had from sources and informants.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, it was. I mean, the call in was critical. Here's another, I tip my hat when I can, and they deserve it, the media. It was a big story. FBI, shootout, tow trucks, a woman, bystander shot. I mean, it made big news. It was all over the news. What was great, it was all over the news. It was, obviously, it's embarrassing, but it's on, the CBS, NBC, ABC, Fox had it. The papers carried it. It was all over the news that afternoon, TV news, and somebody sees it. Somebody sees what's happened up there in North Philly near the garage, sees the news, puts two and two together. Here's the chatter on the block. And because of that, knows who to call. They made their first phone call to the FBI office. That's who they reached out to. And because of that information, that's what kick-started everything. Most of our cases we work, it's a nice orchestra of events where everybody's working together and everybody helps each other out. And Philly PD and FBI have always gotten along well together, and the cooperation with NYPD and certainly our own agency, and New York agents were more than happy to go to that hospital and interview him and Fernando, and they did a phenomenal job getting the information we needed early on. It was great. And just one other thing I remember interesting about the case is, I think it was the next day. It might have been the next day. It was a long day, long night. And the next day in the afternoon, I got called down to Tom Harrington's office, ASAC Harrington, who I think eventually became our deputy director, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, he moved up all the way up to one of those levels right under the director.
He did. And it was that afternoon, I got called down to his office, and Squad 3 supervisor gets called down to his office. And we get in there and we sit down and he shuts the door, and I'm like, oh boy, what's coming now? He just basically said, listen, fellas, this case is important. You guys make sure you dot your I's and cross your T's. We can't have any problems. We got to solve this case. This has to be done right. I just simply said, no problem. It'll get done right. Subsequently, once everything finalized and there was a conviction, I don't recall. I don't know if I called or I at least texted him when he was way high up there in the bureau sphere down there at headquarters, and let him know what had happened. And he texted back he had already found out. I guess he kept his eye on it.
Fantastic. So how long were you on that squad?
So I got on Squad 4, my third rotation as a new agent. When a new agent came into Philly, we would rotate around the office. And I got on there. In fact, I got on that squad in October of 92 and was involved in the first federal carjacking case at the time that was prosecuted out of the Eastern District, and was the first one in the country federally prosecuted, ironically enough. It wasn't my case. I assisted a couple other agents in the office that were involved in it. That got kick-started that way on that squad, and I was on that squad from 92 to the summer of 2003.
So you end up your career. You just retired. Was it this year or last year?
I actually retired a year and a half ago. It was December of 2016.
And you ended your career as a supervisor of
healthcare fraud. I became a supervisor. We had a second violent crime squad formed back in 2010, and I was supervisor of that squad for about a year and a half. And then priorities in the office changed, and I moved from there to the healthcare fraud squad and finished my career as a supervisor of that squad.
So what are you doing now?
So now I took a little time off, and then I started to do some teaching, and now I'm an instructor. I work for a nonprofit in Philadelphia called Year Up, and it's an awesome program that has been built up through private donations from corporations to help overcome the occupational divide between lower income students between the ages of 18 and 24, graduate high school, and the corporate world. They go through an intensive program. It's a year long, hence the name Year Up. The first 6 months is classrooms. They get instruction on anti-money laundering. They get business course. They get soft skills instruction. They get guest speakers, and they have to attend every day 5 days a week. It's 8 hours a day. And if they successfully complete the first half of the program, they are guaranteed an internship at a Fortune 500 company. And it's an awesome program because they successfully complete that internship. Many of them, those internships are turned into jobs, or they're offered jobs in other areas of the companies that they've completed their internship in.
Sounds like a fantastic program. Well, I like to give my guests the last word. So is there anything that you would like to say, either summing up this case or summing up your career?
Well, the best thing I can say is it was a great run. It was a career I have zero regrets. Got to work with and meet awesome people from both law enforcement and then the people you engage with throughout your cases. The FBI is as great a place today as it was when I got there and as it was before I got there. Despite what is out there all the time, we all know as agents the work that gets done and how hard everyone works and how well everyone does, and everyone is trying to do the right thing for the right reason.
And that's the end of the interview. Back at jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of Steve Heaney, and you'll find links to newspaper articles about the case. I hope you enjoyed the episode and that you'll share it with your family, friends, and associates. And don't forget to subscribe to FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcast or your favorite podcast app, so that every Thursday morning, a new episode will be waiting for you on your phone or tablet. Now, my crime fiction recommendation for you this week is a very popular book. As a matter of fact, I understand it's going to be made into a feature film. My recommendation is The Woman in the Window, a novel by A.J. Finn. This book was great. It's a psychological suspense thriller, kind of like Gone Girls or The Girl on the Train. It's about Anna, an agoraphobic woman who lives alone in her New York City home and who is unable to venture outside. So she spends most of her day drinking wine and spying on her neighbors. When the Russells, a father, a mother, and their teenage son, move into the house across the way, they seem to be the perfect family. But then Anna witnesses a violent crime taking place in the Russells' home. And of course, no one believes her. This book is fantastic. There is actually a twist in the story, and when I read it, I actually shouted. So my crime fiction recommendation is The Woman in the Window. And while you're over at Amazon.com picking up a copy of The Woman in the Window, I hope you'll also check out my crime novels, Pay to Play and Greedy Givers, my FBI Philadelphia Corruption Squad series. They're available as ebooks, paperbacks, and Pay to Play is an audiobook too. This episode was sponsored by FBIRetired.com, the only online directory made available to the general public featuring retired FBI agents and analysts interested in showcasing their skills to secure business opportunities. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.